And as some of you may know, All Raise is a nonprofit dedicated to amplifying female voices, accelerating female success, and creating a tech culture where women are leading, shaping, and funding the future. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make events like today's possible. They are very key to amplifying the movement that will rewire the tech and venture capital industry while creating a camaraderie among women and allies as we move forward. And at this point, I would love to introduce our moderator today, Judene Small, originally from Clarendon, Jamaica. She has worked as a director of operations and chief strategy officer for venture-backed startups and has a wealth of experience developing and executing strategic growth plans for various startups and VCs to drive growth. She is currently the COO and co-founder of Roots X Wing, a digital media company focused on highlighting the stories and identities of young Black girls and Black people. Her mission statement is simple: do all that you can while you can to create, improve, and sustain positive generational changes for your community. Please help me welcome Judene Small to the stage.
Hello. You always amp me up. Like I know that I wrote that, but that got me hype. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you, Marian. As she mentioned, my name is Judene Small. I am a proud Jamaican. Also need to put some Brooklyn in there because I'm an East Coast girl and I now live in Los Angeles. I love tech. I love women. I feel like I'm in the perfect sort of season in my life where I am building and growing and amplifying the voices of individuals that I think have something to say. So I won't be long-winded. I am going to let Sevetri and Michelle actually introduce themselves. I find that it's always better to hear it from the founder's mouth. So without further interruption, I would love to have Sevetri introduce herself, and then we can have Michelle, and then we can get into it.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Sevetri Wilson. I'm the founder and CEO of Resilia, and we're a tech company working across a double-sided market. On one side, we support nonprofits and other NGOs with their day-to-day operations. And on the other side, we support funders. So anyone deploying capital, so cities, private foundations, corporations, we help them provide technical assistance on demand to those that they support. We've raised a little bit over $11 million in venture capital to date and are based out of New Orleans and New York. So excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Bacharach. I'm the CEO and co-founder of FindMine. We're a retail technology company using artificial intelligence to scale the creative effort of building a brand's unique perspective or point of view. So we sell to fashion, home, and beauty retailers and brands. I started the company officially in 2014, and then we launched the business in 2016, which I'm sure will be part of the founding questions around, how to set up structures and stuff like that. But we've been doing this with our B2B customers since 2016, and we've raised about $7 million so far. We're based in New York City, although everyone's all over the place at this point. We're fully remote because of COVID. So.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sevetri. And you are absolutely right. So while I was Google internet stalking both of you, I saw that at least on your LinkedIn, you both mentioned being founded in 2016. So I was like, hey, I don't know if they know that. So that's awesome. I would love to start from your origin story, right? I got to speak with both of you before, so I have a little bit of knowledge on how you started. But if maybe, Michelle, you can start telling us about how you started your organization. What was the landscape like from the perspective of legal and taxes? What are some lessons you've learned? And then we can get into the nitty-gritty questions, and she'll just volley over to you after that, Sevetri, if that's okay.
Yeah, so we had maybe an atypical story. So I was leaving my job. I didn't want to work in corporate anymore. I was looking for something else to do. And I had this list of startup ideas that I'd had on my phone for 10 years at that point. And this was in 2014. And so but I didn't have the technical skills to really do much about any of them. I was a product manager, so I knew how to manage technical people, but I didn't have the ability to code myself. And so I teamed up with a friend of mine, the husband of a friend of mine, and he was in school, so he had kind of air cover from a student loans perspective. and he was like willing to work on some side projects. And so we had this like list, but we didn't really have like the official concept of what we were doing yet. So we incorporated the company using a like made up name. We took, the first part of my name and his initials and just jammed them together. And that was the company name. But we incorporated from day one because I had heard from enough other founders who had been there before me that like, you don't want to have a co-founder working on something with you and then later try to paper it, because if it goes really well, then you get into all these, fights about equity, and just, it's a lot cleaner from the start if you just incorporate it. So the first thing we did was basically incorporate it before we even started working on any kind of ideas or concepts or technology. And we incorporated as an S Corp. We can probably talk about that later because I think you have some specific questions around that. But we papered everything. It was a 50-50 equity split, vesting. We used a lawyer to do it for us. Lowenstein Sandler was the one we used at the time. And we found them through like an incubator program where they have office hours and they did some free work for us. And then they had sort of this business in a box package where they just, our NDAs, our invention assignment agreements, our vesting, our restricted stock agreements, just like the full package of things, including articles of incorporation, as well as just all the like people stuff that we had to think about. So we did that from the very start. And then we figured out what the company was going to do. So it was a kind of atypical journey. And then, did a lot of iterations on that. And then finally, at the end of 2015, we sort of figured out what the concept was going to be, did a POC, and we were ready to launch with enterprise customers in June of 2016. So almost 2 years after we kind of put the stake in the ground to found the company, which was a good thing and a bad thing because, we had been vested for 2 years at that point. There's a lot of benefits of that. The bad thing about that, though, was that from a investor perspective, a lot of investors will look at our founding date on like Crunchbase and say, oh, you've been around for, 7 years now, you should be further. But we want to make sure we're getting credit for the work that we've done in the time that we were actually like a proper company and had a product in market. So we get kind of penalized for those extra 2 years, like that we should have been further because it looks like we started that long ago. So there's pros and cons to it, but I think the way we did it was better than having the ambiguity and trying to clean it up after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, we will get into S Corp, and I have some questions about that. In particular, sort of the financial implications around incorporating so early. So as you know, we had a session similar to this, but with lawyers and tax professionals. And one thing they brought to light was how expensive it is to actually go about incorporating, developing an S Corp, and all of the tax implications of that. Were you surprised by any of that, or just in your experience, were you prepared to allocate those resources?
I think in retrospect, it seems so cheap. So it's kind of hard to remember back then when like we weren't paying millions of dollars a year in costs on everything else, like all in. But yeah, I think I don't remember being shocked at how expensive it was, but it is real money. It's like $2,500 for like to pay the lawyers for this package. And then we have to pay all these filing fees. And then you have to pay the maintenance fees. And then every year the Delaware franchise board, because we're now a C Corp and we're registered in Delaware. And they always like send us this massive bill. And we're like, we don't make that much money. How can we like owe this much money? But it's just this dance that you do. And once you've been through it, you sort of know that like, you just send them your cap table, you send them your assets, and they're like, okay, it's actually like $500 instead of, $150,000 or whatever the bill is initially. So I think that you learn these things and then you kind of get used to it and you don't really notice that those are little costs. But I would say you need to set aside about $5,000 to, maybe $7,500 to $7,500 just to like make sure you have some cash to attend to these really important things that you really just can't slack on.
Good to know. Good to know. It seems that you're from the school of the advice that the professionals gave. They said, before you do anything, get a lawyer, get a tax attorney and a tax accountant. Don't make any decisions on your own. So you're a survivor story. Sevetri, I would love to hear your perspective as well.
Yes, so a little bit about my origin story is that I My tech company, Resilia, actually spun out of my first company, Solid Ground Innovation. So I'm definitely like a serial entrepreneur to my heart. I started my first company when I was 22, almost right out of college. Probably had a job outside of for a year prior to doing that. And essentially, I started Solid Ground Innovations, and we were LLC, traditional company framework in which we never took investor capital. And so LLC was like the world I came from. As that business began to grow, I started thinking about opportunities to productize our services, right, and deliver those services through a software solution. I, at the time, had a marketing director who had went to Stanford, and he said, hey, I have a buddy who's a software engineer. He can help you take this idea and really turn it into a company or a product, right? So I flew out to Silicon Valley, met with Ishmael, who became my first like technical advisor. And over the course of 4 days, we put together what became a 20-page specifications deck with wireframes of what now is Resilia. Brought that back to Louisiana, where I'm from, and began to find a team to help me build a minimum viable product. Very similar to Michelle, I wasn't a technical founder. I'm not a technical founder, but I know my strengths. And so I try to lean on others for things that are their strengths. And so we started building this minimum viable product. Originally, I formed the company as an LLC. And this is because I come from the LLC world, right? So I'm like, oh, form LLC, keep going. It wasn't until the company began to think about raising capital that I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to actually convert the company to a corporation, a Delaware corporation. And it was actually a part of the investor terms of my seed round that we would do that, right? Once we closed that round, we would convert into a Delaware corporation. And I always tell founders, like, if you're like, okay, when should I actually just like incorporate? You have to do it when you're thinking about adding a partner or another founder, an employee, an investor, a customer, a grant, a bank account, right? So if you're thinking about all of these things, if you're looking to get intellectual property, right, trademarks, any of those type of things, assets, so taking in capital, that's when you want to think about starting your corporation. So if you check off the box for any of those things, it means that you need to actually incorporate. And I think that as far as the time and cost, it wasn't complicated or difficult to dissolve our LLC and convert into a Delaware corporation. We did also have an attorney do it for us. Interesting enough, very similar to Michelle, I got this first bill back from Delaware Corporation. I'm like, what is this? Like, how are we? It was this crazy bill. So I had to laugh at that because I'm like, oh, okay, they do that to everybody, right? They do that to everyone. And I was like, well, that's not right. You know, you have to go through that process and all of those things. But you definitely have to like monitor those things because your business will go defunct really quickly if you don't respond to those notices. Even if you think they're wrong, you still have to respond and ensure that you're communicating properly. And you know, you can use a number of things. If you don't want to use, say, an attorney, which is more expensive, there are other platforms like Gust, like CSC incorporations, that they'll actually do it for you for a lot cheaper, right? But it's the maintenance of those things that you want to be mindful of. And I think that's where attorney can become really helpful with, like, what do you need to do to actually maintain and stay in good standing. But there are services that you can, you know, kind of put on autopilot to help you do that if you're not taking in a lot of capital where you're like, okay, I really need to pay all this money to attorney, because I don't know what your attorney costs per hour, but my attorney is not cheap. So if you're just starting out, if you have no money in the bank, you know, if you haven't taken on investors, you don't have really a lot of assets or anything, and you want to go a cheaper route, I definitely think using platforms like Gust or CSC Incorporation can help you reduce the costs that it may cost you to actually incorporate. But just a couple of different tips, and really what my origin story was going from the LLC to that incorporation.
Thank you so much. And this is exactly what sort of the experts said. It's that first thing they said is you have to be intentional, right? Before you even start, figure out your milestones. Are you interested in getting venture funding? Are you going to apply for grants? Anything that you're going to do, there is an action that's required. And they do encourage that you go to a lawyer, right? They highlighted some of those resources that you mentioned, Sevetri, but I think you hit a real nugget that I want to tap into is the maintenance of that, right? Understanding the pros and the cons of your decisions and what's required, because you're right, they love a bill. I can't tell you how many bills. They just love to send it. It's their favorite thing to do. I just wonder if they got stock in paper. I don't know, but they love to mail a bill. And that brings me to sort of before you all branched out on your own and before you decided to, Sevetri, you are, I don't know your background, but you sound like my dad, who was just a serial entrepreneur, and he just had no interest ever to work to someone else. I think he might have done it for a year or even 2 months, and then he was like, that's it. But what are some of the financial steps you set for yourself, right? Like Michelle, you really talked about the fact that this is something you knew you wanted to do for 10 years. You had it in your notes. Like, how did you prepare yourself? A lot of the entrepreneurs that are listening are at that stage, right? They're at the ideation phase. They're trying to figure out where to go. Some might have some reserves, some might not. Sort of what advice would you give them before you even step out on your own financially to prepare?
Yeah. The first thing for me was like having an idea that was exciting enough to do it, because like when I first incorporated this, it was sort of like, we're just going to play startup for a little while. And like the cost was, you know, I had a co-founder, we split the cost of the few $1,000s, and it was really cheap because we didn't have any overhead. It was nothing except like maintaining the, you know, the S Corp status and like filing taxes. But we used my friend whose husband this was, her brother is a tax accountant. So like we got like friends and family discounts. Like we made it cheap enough to just kind of like incubate something without really committing 100% until we hit on this one idea. And that idea had been something that was on my list for 10 years, or 10 years, I guess now. So it's been like 6 or something years, but it just kept coming back and coming back and coming back. And I think that was the biggest thing. It's like, financial risk is relative. Like you might not spend $20 on something, but you might spend $2,000 on something because it's worth it to you. So for me, like having the idea be really, really worth all of the, not only financial commitment, but also just like blood, sweat, and tears, like so many years on, when it's just really hard to get out of bed in the morning because you're having a really shitty time at the company and you can't leave, and you know everyone else is bailing. Like that was the biggest hurdle rate for me. And then from like the actual financial side, I was fortunate enough to have like a spouse who was supportive, who had a good job. We had savings that we could, you know, lean on. And then we moved to a cheaper apartment and like saved some more money that way. And then just we're really scrappy with how we spent our money. So that was part of the like prep, was just making sure that my husband and my financial security safety net was there along the way. And we kind of renewed it in sort of like 6-month installments, where it'd be like, okay, we've been doing this 6 months. Like, is there enough there that it makes sense to continue and take further financial risk and double down? Or is it time to go get a regular job and like just make some money again? So we just kept renewing that, you know, lease on the startup experiment. But I think those are the 2 biggest factors, was 1, just making sure the idea was worth it. And then 2, making sure I had my support network in place, both emotionally and financially.
Yeah, proper planning. What is it? Piss poor planning begets piss poor performance. So if you plan properly and you're intentional, you know, you can make anything happen. Sevetri, I would love to hear your perspective as well as a serial entrepreneur, 22. It must have been an interesting journey.
Yeah, I love that quote that you just said. And I immediately thought about another quote, right? That it's interesting how we like prepare overall, right? And it's like everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that is the entrepreneur journey. Just thinking about, sometimes you can just be prepared and still just, you're going, you don't know what's coming sometimes, right? Until you get to that point where you have to figure it out. When I think about personal finances, I think that I always hear from entrepreneurs and founders who are like, oh, you know, I don't have any money, I have to raise capital and all these other things. And it's like, you have to figure out a plan, because I don't have any founder friends that haven't put who have not put their own personal money into their business. Yes, do they exist? Yes, they do exist. Some people are able to have an idea and immediately raise capital or have the ability to tap into funding in some form or fashion. But I do feel that you have to be ready to invest your own personal finances to get an idea off of the ground. And for me, I had started my first business and bootstrapped that business and was able to stay pretty lean. But when I started my software company, a tech company, it's expensive. Software is expensive to build. And I started taking like the profits that I was making and getting from my first business, and I was investing it, like pouring money into the tech company. And this is like prior to us like raising capital. And then there was times where I was like, man, am I making the right decisions? Or man, the other investments I could have made with this type of capital, but I was committed to what I was building and I was committed to wanting to see it through. And so I was making a lot of personal financial sacrifices in order to do that. Certain things that people would tell me along the way, and I got hip to, along the way myself, is that you can writing yourself a note, right? So that you're able to secure some of that investment back. By the time I had invested a lot of money, I actually got hip to this from one of my mentors. He was like, are you writing yourself a note just related to what you're investing in your company? And I was like, no, I'm just dumping it in here. I'm just spending the money. And when I got hip to that, I did write myself a note. And instead of me investing all this money and investing down like a black hole, it was going to something. We were seeing the product, we were seeing things come to fruition. But I also knew I was going to raise capital at some point, right? I own a portion of the equity, and we were taking money, reallocating it, from SGI to Resilia. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to give a loan. I'm going to actually make this a loan to Resilia. And when I went out and raised my Series A, I was able to pay back that loan because now I had the capital to pay back that loan. So those are things that I feel like founders are never told that if you do actually are successful with this, that the money that you've sunk into your company, ensure that there's a pathway for you to even recoup some of that money. Or in this other instance, my other company was able to recoup the money that they had invested.
Listen, come on now. I just got chills. Recoup is the word of the day. Yes. Please tell us a little bit more. So when you talk, I've never heard about this, so I'm really intrigued myself. So a note, is that do you explain what that is to me in general?
Well, in our case, we had like a convertible note, a safe, you're essentially putting yourself on your cap table as that money that you're investing in the company, right? At some point we were like investing so much money, and I'll tell you guys, like I invested almost $1 million of my own personal money into my company. So we're not talking about like $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 where you're like, oh, that's just an investment sunk. I was sinking a lot of money into the startup. And so just think about fast forward, now the company's successful, but to never recoup that money in any shape or form would have been horrible. And so many founders never recoup their money because they never set themselves up for the potential of recouping it once their business is successful. And I was able to do that by essentially beginning to create a loan. So my company, SGI, loaned Resilia X amount of $100,000. And when I was able to afford to pay that money back, we were able to afford to pay it back. We did that. And not one every investor saw that. They were like, that was pretty smart of you to do that.
Also, it gets harder to do later. So like,
yes, it does.
Yeah. Like do it early, because once you have investors on your cap table or you have other note holders, there's rules about having to get approved, like notes that are senior to them.
Yes.
So do it early and often, and then you probably can't do it as much later on.
No, like today where we sit, we would never be able to do it. We would never be able to do it. But it was already on, the loan was already there. So investors came in already seeing all of that, in place. And most investors were like, yeah, that's actually pretty smart.
Well, everyone here, we just got the lessons on lessons on lessons. So this is something that you should be thinking about as you think about company formation, as you think about how you want to recoup those funds. So we have the maintenance theme words of the day, ensuring that when you're making your decisions around getting a lawyer or going to a public resource center, all are great, but knowing those implications and knowing what you have to do. I personally cannot maintain with those bills, so I know that I'm just going to have to get a lawyer. And on the other end, when you're thinking about your investment, making sure that you're getting a note there, making it a loan, so then you can recoup it when you raise capital if you are interested in going the venture back route. I love that. This is I guess still fun, but maybe not as fun. I would love for you to get a little bit granular about legal structures for founders. We heard that you started as an LLC, Sevetri. Michelle, you hit it right out the gate as a corporation. If you don't mind, from your perspective, let us know if there are any benefits from a founder perspective on either.
I think so we started as an S Corp because my co-founder's father-in-law was a tax attorney, and it was a good and bad thing. So, he knew there was tax benefits to being an S Corp because we were going to lose a lot of money initially. So an S Corp is a pass-through entity, which means all the company's profits, you have to declare on your own personal tax return and pay taxes on them personally. And all the company's losses, you declare on your tax return as losses, and then you can, offset that against other income you have to save on your taxes. So knowing that startups require a lot of investment to start, we were going to lose a lot of money for a while. It was a tax benefit to us individually to do it as an S Corp. The drawbacks to that were it's harder to set up an S Corp than a C Corp, it's harder to set up an S Corp than an LLC. There's just more paperwork and more cost to it. The second drawback with S Corps and LLCs is that you don't start the clock on what's called qualified small business stock. I don't know if the professionals talk to you about that, but basically it means that if you own C corporation stock for 5 years, and there's some other qualifiers to it as well, then you don't pay taxes on the first $10 million in proceeds. But you have to own the stock for 5 years, which means if you sell it before that time period, you don't get that benefit. And that means if you're in like a 40% tax bracket and you sell for $10 million, $4 million is going to the government. It's a big amount of money you're talking about. So basically you file this thing called an 83B election when you when you purchase your restricted stock. And this is definitely something you need to have a lawyer or an accountant help you with. But anyone who's done startup law before or startup accounting before will know this. This is like startup stuff 101. The other drawback to using my co-founder's father-in-law as our accountant or our lawyer, or like our advisor, our legal advisor, because we did use a lawyer, was that he didn't know startups. And so he was like leading us down a path that didn't include any of these nuggets of wisdom that could save us millions of dollars in the future. And our startup lawyer, the one who had done our incorporation, was like, wait a minute, like you need to do these things. These are super important. So having someone who's not just a lawyer or an accountant, like even if they're free and you're getting some like pro bono services, they can actually waste you a lot of money and like just end up being so much more costly in the long run than getting someone who really knows startup specific stuff. So we did the 83B election when we formed as an S Corp, purchased our restricted stock, paid tax at that time. So then when we sell, we don't have to pay tax because we paid it already. But of course, the value of the company on day one was $5,000. It was literally the amount of money we put into it on day one. So the tax was very low. And then you have to be a C Corp for the 5 years before you sell in order to get that benefit. So if we had stayed an S Corp for, 3 or 4 years longer, that would be 3 or 4 years later that we would be able to sell and get that benefit. So it's really important to make sure you know about that timing. And when you're starting your company, you're definitely not thinking about selling it. You're just starting, but like it comes so quickly that the earlier you do that, the better. And then the other, like the mistake that we made with the S Corp thing is that, like an LLC, if you have an external shareholder or like you have to become a C Corp. But we didn't, and an S Corp is basically just like a box that you check on the form when you're filling out your corporation incorporation documents. So the process is identical to being a C Corp. It's just you check the box for S. So we check the box for S, and then automatically, if you meet any of these criteria that like make you a C Corp, you just trip over into being a C Corp. There's nothing that like, you don't have to take any action. It just automatically happens, which is good and bad because like it surprised us. And then all of a sudden we owed all this tax we didn't know we owed because now we were a legal corporations. The corporation owned taxes and we missed our tax filing for that. We owed all this. Talk about like surprise bills with scary numbers. Like we owed all this back taxes and there are all these penalties. And we're like, when did we become a C Corp? This is crazy. And the way that it happened was we gave 3% of common stock to, if you give common stock to individuals, it doesn't trip it. But we gave 3% of our common stock to an accelerator program that we did. And it was a corporation that it went to, not the individuals in the corporation. So by virtue of having like a corporation on our cap table under the common stock section, and I was like, I thought it was just preferred stock and doing a financing was the thing that's going to trip it. It's not. So just keep in mind, if you give equity to anyone who's like maybe an advisor, but they form their own LLC to do their dealings and they want their LLC on your cap table, if you're an S Corp or an LLC, it's going to trip that thing where you need to become a C Corp. So anyway, that was probably really complicated, but that was the story behind it and some things to watch.
Not complicated at all. Very, very good information. And again, they're sneaky. They just tripping and slipping. That's not okay. Sevetri, did you have similar experiences? I know you started out as an LLC, so I would love to hear your experience as well, tips and tricks, and were there any gotchas similar to Michelle?
I don't think we had any gotchas, but I definitely think that if you think you're going to raise capital, if you think, I mean, there's just some like boxes, right, that will just take you down the C Corporation or S Corp path. And the biggest reason why, tax implications. And I think that that essentially is what Michelle was getting at with her answer. Tax implications, that's like the biggest thing.
And in your wise words, would you just say, get a tax accountant? Because I know I can't manage the taxes and the implications. And I know on our call, we talked about even foreign entities and where you're incorporated and the implications of that. I would love to hear your experiences dealing with, being national. Like, you have large organizations, you employ people. What are the tax implications of that? What's something that as a early stage founder or somebody who's in the ideation phase as well, I should think about or they should think about? I
think, I mean, we have team members in 6 locations now. And right now, everyone is like working all across the country, but unless that's your permanent domicile, and that's what I'm looking forward to seeing, how the government is going to figure out how to get money from people with these non-realistic offices all across the country, because we pay taxes in Atlanta and Georgia because we have employees there. They're not remote, right? They're not working digitally. We actually hired them in the state of Georgia. Right now, we're all getting over for the most part. Everybody's kind of getting over. But I think states are going to be like, no, you're going to have to divvy up some money there as well. But I would just recommend getting a tax attorney when you start seeing those type of, or you're having that type of movement. New York is a lot different than Louisiana, right? And so the implications there, even more why you have to have an attorney for those type of things. Employment, everything's different. It's almost like 2 different worlds when you look at what our obligations are in New York to do business in New York, right? Because a lot of this, like, you're doing business in. And when you file that form that says you're doing business in a place, then you have new tax obligations. So we talk about like the federal, but also their state, right? And so you think about these things related to just Treasury, right? And revenue, Department of Revenue. And so just like we get a bill from Delaware, we get a bill from Louisiana as well, Department of Revenue, because we have employees and we have an office. So we're doing business here. We're doing business in New York. And so when you think about those type of complexities around employment, that's what it becomes even more critical that you have someone kind of right there by your side.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another question, but I see that Tanya sent a question, so I just wanted to get to it. And Michelle, maybe you can take it, and then Sevetri, if you have anything to add on. How do you capture and record deferred compensation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Savitri talked about is key, which is like do it as a loan to the company. Like you can actually, well, so there's pros and cons to all of this, right? But like deferred compensation has tax implications for the company and for the recipient. So you need to talk to like a lawyer if you want to do like proper deferred compensation, or tax advisor. But there's other creative ways to do that and make sure you're getting paid. So it could be, the company pays you, you're on salary on the books or whatever as a consultant. And then you're putting your own money back into the company. The downside of that is there's taxes getting taken out. But it's a way to paper it that's can be easier in some ways than the deferred comp. You can also, your equity is meant to give you, like, one of my investors just told me that like half of his portfolio companies CEOs weren't taking any salary until the Series B, because they just rather have that money go toward hiring other people and stuff like that. So it's kind of expected that your salary is going to be low or no if you're the CEO, because you have 50% or more of the company at the start. It's really when you start getting diluted down significantly that then you're expected to get much more in cash compensation. And then also you might get topped up on your equity as well. But yeah, there's creative ways to do deferred compensation where you're just like, like loaning the company money in kind, but definitely like a tricky area because of all the tax implications. Like the government just wants to make sure you're not scamming them out of money. And a lot of people who are not like upstanding, would-be entrepreneurs like this group will do that. And so that's why there's all these landmines around deferred comp. But I think it makes a lot of sense in the early stage entrepreneur context, because you got to get paid. Like at some point you need to make this worth something. But the juice might not be worth the squeeze to do it from day one, because really your equity is your payday at the end of the rainbow. So I don't have any like magic bullet advice for that. But if you want to do deferred comp as defined, definitely talk to a lawyer.
I love that. And since we're now on the theme of how we're going to maintain the coins when we're paying all the bills, I would love for, I think it was in our conversation, was it you, Sevetri, or was it you, Michelle? I can't remember, that we talked about the digital tax credits, and that blew my mind. So please take it away. This is sort of the section where we figure out creative ways to save money because we are spending a lot of money. Either one can jump.
I think we both talked about like tax credits across the board, but I just doubled down on ensuring that you're talking to whatever state you're in, ensuring that you're talking to your economic development offices, both at the state and local level, because they literally are designed, we're all paying for it with our taxpayer dollars. And so there are a lot of incentives for businesses in Louisiana, right, to spark innovation. And so those things are incentivized. So I know here in Louisiana, also in Connecticut, I believe there are like these idea of digital tax credits. Now, Louisiana and even in Georgia, digital tax credits also cover tech, right? And so they created digital tax credits for a number of different things, everything from like film production, et cetera. But the communities in the tech world are like, oh, well, we want to be covered as well. We want to be able to get tax credits. And so they covered anything related to building software and the production of that. And so we were able to access digital tax credits as a company. Even ways like if you're sitting in an opportunity zone, all these opportunity zones that have popped up all across the US, there are investors, there are people who are looking to invest in businesses because they have to put money somewhere, who are in opportunity zones. I literally have investors reach out to me all the time saying, hey, are you in opportunity zone? Because we want to invest in your company. And it's not necessarily, they've never seen my portfolio of work, but they're looking for businesses based on what they have to do to get their tax breaks to invest in, who are in certain areas. And in New Orleans, Opportunity Zone is downtown New Orleans, right? There are opportunity zones right across from what we would consider some of the highest price neighborhoods in the whole city. And people have no idea of how they could benefit from being in opportunity zones. So definitely meet with your local economic development offices and your state economic development offices. There's usually a small business services person that sits there, and that person is there to actually read the law and policies that have been created to support small businesses and businesses in general, as well as the creation of more innovative tech ecosystems throughout the state. So that's definitely my advice when it comes to incentives, R&D tax credits, et cetera. And accountants know this information too, good accountants. So that's just my feedback there.
Before we volley it over to Michelle, I would love for you to share the unemployment comp story that we talked about too, because that's a sort of another area that founders should be aware of.
Yes, so I was talking about unemployment primarily because it's so different, kind of going back to what I said earlier about what is the case in one state may be different for another state. And I was just speaking to, we had an employee that resigned to go take another position back in more of a corporate world, decided that startup wasn't the space for him after all. And he went on to another company, and he was laid off from that company within a matter of like 3 months of being there. And he filed unemployment, and we got a letter as well saying that we had to pay into his unemployment. And so essentially that we had to pay anyone that he was employed by for that last year received that letter. And so imagine my eyes when I got an unemployment letter for an employee we never laid off, we never fired, et cetera, who willingly left the company. And so those are the type of things that you go to your tax attorney and you go to others to help you figure out, like, wait, do I really have to pay this, or am I just getting this letter for some other reasons? Do we have to submit any information, right? And so one of the lowest hanging fruits that I can tell founders is check your mail timely. Because I can tell you how many letters people were just like, I didn't even realize we had this tax bill 3 months ago. It came in and we missed it. We just didn't open up the letter. And because the IRS isn't, they're not emailing you anything. So check your mail. That's a low hanging fruit. Because sometimes just responding on time before the deadline would save you so much headache.
Major key. I hate paper mail. I think I've already expressed that. Michelle, I would love to hear your perspective. I know she don't respect me. The grandmas don't care. They're like, so what? You're doing a little panel. Who cares? Michelle, over to you.
Yeah, so it's definitely very state specific. The one that we took advantage of in New York is called Startup New York. I'm not even sure they still do it anymore because we're not doing it anymore, but it seems similar to like this opportunity zone concept. But there was different like economic development sites in the state. And if you're co-located there, then you get deferred taxes for your corporation, but also your employees didn't pay New York City or state income tax. So that meant that for every dollar going to for every dollar of salary we're paying an employee, they were keeping 10% more of it, basically. So it was almost a recruiting benefit. The challenge is it was a very bureaucratic process, super hard to navigate. We fortunately we did it through NYU, like an NYU site. So there was like an NYU liaison who was there to help us. But then every year our payroll company would screw it up and our employees got the wrong things on their W-2s and had to go through all that. So at the end of the day, I'm not really sure, unless we were like a very profitable corporation and we wanted to save all the money on corporate income tax, if it was really worth it. My employees might say yes, it was worth the hassle because they did save several $1,000s, but that's the trade-off with these. They're like incredibly specific and really not user-friendly. And so that's why you end up spending a lot of time with like a lawyer, an accountant, or somebody to help you navigate them, because you could spend all your time doing these tax credits. We also do R&D tax credits, which is a federal program. So you get credit back on your payroll taxes for any like developer salary or anything related to R&D, so like product people, developers, designers, data scientists, stuff like that. But there's companies out there that will basically do this for you, and then they take a percentage cut. And it's like so much easier than trying to figure out how to do it on your own. So it's all about like the value of your time and where else it could be used. So sometimes it just is cheaper to have a lawyer do it, or if you're going to screw something up and the risk is really high, like just pay more now. But the first thing is just knowing that they exist. And so I agree with Sevetri that like look at your local economic development offices, look at SBA.gov. The SBA has different like advisors and coaches and stuff that can help you make use of SBA resources. So there's a lot of that stuff out there. So the research part, definitely do all that. But once you like identified a program that you think you qualify for, maybe at that point it's time to get somebody in to help you, just so you make sure you do it right and you make sure that it's not like taking up more of your time than it's worth. Absolutely.
And I think that's a really, really good call out. Understand the value of your time. And sometimes it's better to defer to the experts and get it right the first time than not getting it right the first time. Just to pivot a little bit, and then we'll go into some rapid fire questions because we're approaching time. In the comments, we had a question of, do you have any perspectives on hiring contractors versus employees in terms of taxes or other implications? I will give it to Sevetri since we just heard from the beautiful Michelle. Let's hear you.
I mean, contractors are pretty standard. You have to make sure that they're contractors, though. I think that the implications are how you use contractors and how they report to you, record keeping, invoicing. Like, they have to truly be contractors, and you have to treat them like contractors. Otherwise, that there are like tax implications there, right? How you're reporting. And that's like where they have to be during the day, where if you're giving them equipment like computers, so you have to ensure that contractors are treated as contractors. And even if you have them as like full-time contractors, that you also are, and we use JustWorks. I don't know what anybody else systems people use, but we use JustWorks, and it actually is really easy because it streamlines the process for you. Even when you put the information about the employee, when you put where they're located, where, how many hours they're working, if they're full-time, you put those systems in place. And I said, JustWorks is a system that we use. And so they essentially automate the practices so that you understand the tax implications for that particular contractor or employee. And so for us, when I think about implications with hiring contractors versus employees, if you're hiring an employee and you're treating them like a contractor, that's probably not going to fly, or vice versa. And so I think that that's where you need to ensure that you're in the right frame. And attorney, hate to go back to attorneys, but your attorney is going to look at your contracts, et cetera, and there are specific contract attorneys that you can use, and that's what they do day in and day out, to ensure that you aren't impacted by implications by utilizing contractors in ways they shouldn't be utilized.
Great. I think you hit all of those nuggets, especially for a lot of people. From a financial standpoint, sometimes it makes sense to engage with contractors to start. Just being very careful, like Sevetri said, about not treating them as full-time employees, because they are not. I think that's the big key. One thing I learned was down to the laptops that you mentioned. Like, I thought I was doing something great. Like, let me just send a little laptop. No. They need to be able to control their time when they engage, when they do work, and even something that like that can be a trigger, right? And it's all about de-risking yourself. And that's sort of a theme both you and Michelle have been talking about this entire time. Just make sure that you de-risk yourself. Lean into your strengths, but also lean into the strengths of others. So I think that's really, really, really great advice.
And there's always a lot of gray areas sometimes. You're going to be like, oh, can we not? And so I love the word that you de-risk. That's exactly a big part of business.
Every time I talk to my lawyer, or every time I email my lawyer and I'm like, it's going to be a quick answer. I'm just going to like double check, you know, make sure this is fine. She's always like, can we get on a call? And I'm like, no, because they're going to charge me for it. But it's always like some kind of like, you know, super gray area and like 50 different factors to consider. And I'm like, damn, this really isn't as easy as I want it to be, where it's like a black and white situation.
Right, right. And since another question, since we're on the topic of lawyers, right? Because these are important people to have in your corner, as well as tax attorneys. A question from the audience is, what questions would you ask when hiring a startup lawyer? Like maybe your top 3. Ask them this and you'll be straight, or if you forget to ask them this, then you're putting yourself in at risk. What's been your experience?
Personally, I don't think there's any questions you need to ask the lawyer other than what's your hourly rate? And maybe like, is there an associate, like a less expensive associate that's tag teaming this with you, and then you're just reviewing to save the time, like, because partners are obviously more expensive. I think the questions you need to ask are to the other companies that this lawyer has worked with. So find out as many, you know, references as they can give you. Just talk to those people and just try to find references that they haven't given you, to see if anyone had a bad experience. But they're like, amongst startup lawyers, there's just like sort of a handful of known startup lawyers like Cooley, Gunderson, Lowenstein, Wilmer Hale. Like there's just a couple of names that are always out there for startup law. So if you just talk to like 10 different founders, you probably get a good sampling among them. And then like find out which partners they like. And then that's probably who I would approach. Because I think at the end of the day, like, it's pretty, like, my lawyer, I like him, he's fine, but it's not like the same thing as a co-founder relationship. They just need to be good at law. And if they're part of one of these bigger firms, and if they're a partner that's been doing this for a while, like, maybe ask them, or maybe ask the startups that work with them, if you get the sense that they're like more on the conservative side or more on the like, no lawyer is ever loosey-goosey. Let's just be clear. Like, you don't go into that if you're going to be a risk taker, because they're all about protecting the risk. But some lawyers are very conservative, where sometimes that can work against you. Some lawyers are like much more comfortable just being like, okay with doing it this way, and here's like our mitigation strategy. But I would only get that information from someone who's worked with the lawyer, not from the lawyer themselves, because they're not going to be able to evaluate as well. Sorry. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Great advice.
And I think one of the questions that we had, we actually just went through the process of switching attorneys. And 2 things that rang clear was, one, we needed attorney who could also do, that had the ability to do immigration law. And so you'll find even some of the big firms are like, no, we don't do that. We outsource that to someone else. So there are certain things.
Like 4 lawyers. So it's not even just one. I was talking about like the corporate law one, which is the one who helps you, like, they're the one you're probably in touch with the most. They help you raise money. They help you with like, you know, just big corporate type things like formation, all that stuff, equity. But we have a corporate lawyer, we have an employment lawyer, we have a real estate lawyer, and we have a patent attorney. And they're different. They're all different people. Oh, and we have a contracts lawyer. The contracts lawyer used to be in the same firm as the corporate, but then he moved to a different firm, and we just liked him so much we kept him. So like, it doesn't even, that's what I'm saying, it's kind of fungible. Like the firm doesn't matter. It's like more about the person and about the specialty that they have. And doing one size fits all, like, don't do that, because no lawyer has enough expertise in every single area to cover you well.
Right. And definitely like something that we use Fisher Burrows as our main attorney, primarily when we go through anything related to corporate documents, anything related to investors, anything related to, raising new funding rounds. And then we have another attorney that's kind of like our day-to-day attorney for like other small odd-end things, because our other attorney is very expensive. And so sometimes we'll use another attorney just because the cost is a lot easier, and it's more like day-to-day things that are just like any law firm could possibly do. A startup attorney can do it.
Great advice. I feel like every time I hop on one of these, I learn so much because you think you know, but you have no idea. We are approaching time, so I'm just going to ask one more question from both of you. With 2 minutes left, if there is one thing you want to ensure that the founders hear today in their path forward when they're thinking about taxes and legal. Okay, I saw your face, Michelle, so maybe two instead of one. 2 to 3 things. I'll give you more
A lot
room.
of pressure. Yeah. I'm not the expert.
No pressure. Just from your experience, it was just like, you know what, this is the one thing that I'm so happy I did it. And it could just be go back to the fact that you said that I'm happy that I trusted the professionals and I allowed them to do it. And that is a fair answer. And for someone, that could be the answer. And Sevetri, it could be trial by fire. Like you trusted the experts, but you had the opportunity to work under different sort of legal structures, going from the LLC, then having to get venture funding, having to adjust. You then went through this process of getting a new lawyer, right? Also for everyone that's listening, their LinkedIns, the socials, the Twitters, the company websites will be provided for our founder experts, because you are experts, because your experience is invaluable. Maybe I answered the question for you just now. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think my advice is just find people who are good and don't reinvent the wheel. Like there is a time when you're at, Sevetri's stage where you can switch lawyers and change things up, because once you know, then you know, and then you can kind of finagle a better rate or go with someone who you like better or whatever, because now you know how to evaluate it. But I think I saw a question around like JustWorks, Gusto, QuickBooks, whatever. Like there's a reason so many startups use JustWorks. There's a reason so many startups use Carta. There's a reason so many startups use the big startup law firms. Like just start there. You're less likely to go wrong, and then optimize for cost later, because getting it right from the start is so much easier with the big ones, because at the start it's super easy. So it's like relatively lower costs at the start, and then it's more complicated, but you're really going to screw yourself over if you try to cheap out in the very early stages and get things wrong. Like that's where stuff blows up just when you don't want it to.
Right. What about you, Queen Sevetri?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of go back to and zero in on the trying to like de-risk and trying to get as much done right to begin with. I just think that there's always like room for error, but the goal is that you're not trying to get over an IRS, right? And so I think that you don't underestimate like the good intention and then having knowledgeable people around you to ensure that they have your back covered. And I think that that's like the importance, like with attorneys. Our original attorney that we were working with was great. He was local. We love working with like local attorneys and things of that nature. But when we moved over to Fisher Brawls, it was not only my desire, but also my investors' desire to hire an attorney that had done later stage deals, right? And so working with someone, now you can probably find like a partner. If you're working with a small shop, that may not be the case, but if you're working with large firms, they have a partner or someone that has done this over and over and over again. And so my preference is having a smaller attorney who I can work with my day-to-day, who knows my local environment, who knows my local community, who's very, like sends me information like, hey, are you going, we're speaking on the same panel tomorrow. Like I love that relationship with my attorney. And that's why, even though I had to go get another law firm to do these other things and to be able to do Series B, Series C and beyond, I still kept my local startup attorney because I like being able to, have that relationship.
I love that. Very different perspectives, but also valuable. And it centers around this one thing. There is no one size fits all when it comes to being a founder and an entrepreneur. You're going to have to figure it out. There will be bumps and bruises, but if you prepare and are flexible about when things deviate and move, you're set up for success. I would love to bring Marion back on. I'm so happy I got to spend time with Sevetri and Michelle today. And we also are excited because our girl has a book, Sevetri. So please support, and I'll let Marion close us out. But all of these videos are recorded. Tanya, I saw your question about a tip. Mike Moyse, which was a CPA on our panel yesterday, or the day before, pardon me, he was pumping Expensify. He said that one of the things you should always do is have good record keeping. So at the very least, if this seems daunting or you have to plan for a little bit longer, get your phone, take pictures, and just start uploading everything. And even if it's to Gmail, if you don't want to pay for I think it's $3 a month for Expensify. That was his advice, and I think it was good advice. Thank you for having me, Marian. Over to you.
Yes, oh my God, the gems, everything I have never heard founders talk about and like the importance. But thank you to both of our speakers today, Judene as a moderator, and then yes, Sevetri, you have your book that just came out, How to Overcome Anything and Build a $1 Million Business with or Without Capital. I've bought the book. I'm really excited to jump in and start reading it. But, to all of you out there, I think this is just a great way, another great resource and insight into a founder's like step-by-step. And then, of course, as always, we would love your feedback for those on the call. Take your phone, quick scan, take 2 minutes. We'd love to hear what you thought. What else do you want to learn more about? It's always helpful for us. And yes, Sevetri and Michelle, thank you for sharing your stories, for being so vulnerable and like really getting into the nitty gritty that I wish more founders would do, or I wish we had more panels like this. So thank you, Dean, for really pulling in those gems. And we look forward to keeping in touch and hearing how your companies are doing throughout these months and the years. And yeah, it's been a pleasure and appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yes,
Take
absolutely.
care. Good luck.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
That was really good.